Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today we're going to paint this beautiful watercolor crayon poppy. And if you want a real-time version of this tutorial, you can find it in Critique Club. I will put a link in the video description. It's $5 a month and it gives you access to over 50 advanced to intermediate real-time long tutorials. So it can help you grow and learn as an artist. And I'll talk about that more at the end of the video. But let's get started here. I'm working on a piece of mat board that's about a mossy, I don't know, maybe like a mossy sage green color, and I'm sketching on my poppy using a white watercolor pencil. You could also use a piece of chalk, you could use a white pastel pencil, you could even use a colored pencil for this because the watercolor crayon should stick on top of that just fine. Now if you're not that confident in your drawing ability, what you could do is you could print out the reference photo and you could transfer it on either by rubbing the back of the photo with a piece of chalk and then drawing over it just like a regular tracing, or you could use something called white transfer paper, and that is kind of like almost as like a tracing paper that's got this coating of like a white waxy substance, and you use it just like graphite paper or carbon paper. It works fantastic, and you can use the same piece of paper like hundreds of times, so it's really nice to have in your art stash when you're going to work on toned surfaces, because you don't want to do a bunch of erasing. So I just gave you a peek there of my watercolor crayon collection, and the brand I'm using is the Caran Neocolor 2. Now Caran makes a couple different pastels. They make the original Neocolor ones, and those are a wax pastel that are not water soluble. A lot of people like to use those like as an encaustic type medium. These are the Neocolor 2 water soluble crayons. So you want to make sure you get the Neocolor 2 if you want to do this effect. I also recommend the Lyra watercolor crayons. They're nearly as good. They're very high quality, but they're a lot cheaper. So if you're looking for a budget alternative, I would highly recommend those. And I will list all of this in the video description. Now, another product that I like is the Crayola Portfolio water soluble oil pastels. They are under $10 for a set of 24 currently, and that's actually what I started with to see if I like this medium before investing in the Caran. So this stage here is I'm basically just blocking in color, because before I can do any blending or anything, I need to have a lot of color down, or I'm just going to end up with a watery, streaky mess. Now, watercolor crayons, the way that I like to use these watercolor crayons is I like to take advantage of their opacity. Now, not all watercolor crayons have that ability, so that's why I recommend specifically the Caran or the Lyra ones, because there are a lot of watercolor crayons out there that are just too hard and transparent to use in this fashion, and if you're going to use them on a toned paper like this, they just wouldn't show up. And you can even use pastel paper for this, because we're not going to add a ton of water. So any sort of toned surface you have. I just happen to have a lot of mat board scraps because I used to do professional picture framing before YouTube, or actually when I started YouTube I was still doing that. So I have a lot of those, plus I frame my own work, so there's lots of mat board scraps around for me to take advantage of, and I just really love the surface. So I'm using a variety of colors. I am using reds. I'm using like a ruby red. That's probably my most true red. I'm using a raspberry, which is a little more on the pink side. I'm using salmons, pinks, peaches, those types of colors. The one downside I will say to the watercolor crayons, the Caran and the Lyras to an extent, is their reds are not super vibrant. Because these are opaque, you lose a little bit with your really vibrant colors. Red, if you've ever tried to paint a red wall, like a wall red in your house, you know how many coats of paint that takes, right? It's such a transparent color if you want a really bright, like clean red. So because it's an opaque medium, you end up with a little bit of a pinky red. Just keep that in mind. Now you can use these watercolor crayons with gouache if you want to pull in that really, really bright, vibrant red at the end. Now, I didn't do this for this piece, but maybe you have a different brand of watercolor crayons, or for whatever reason, they're just not able to lay thick enough on the surface you're using. That's something you can do to help boost your color saturation. So since I've got a nice layer of the crayon colored in, now I'm using a brush and I'm just blending. Now, it's really important when you add your water that you don't add a lot. Now, I purposely am using my most shallow water container, and I'm just dipping the bristles into the water. I'm not letting the water get up on the handle, because if I do and I get a droplet of water slide down the brush and get on my artwork, it's going to just make a puddle. It's going to lift up all that product I have down there. So very, very, very little water. I cannot stress that enough. That is what is going to make this project a success or not, is how much water you have on that brush. And you just want enough to dissolve the pigment, and that is that. The pigment is very soft. It blends very easily on its own without water. So this water is just like, it's just kind of gently activating the pigment. Now, the wonderful thing about the watercolor crayons is that you can layer them up. In fact, I had a colleague who would do these tiny little paintings with watercolor crayons, and she's the person that got me excited about these. This was probably like 20 years ago. And they looked like tiny little oil paintings, and they were just beautiful. And I'm like, a watercolor crayon? What? And she kind of showed me what she knew, and that's kind of how I learned. And it wasn't a technique I'd seen those crayons used for. So I'm sharing the love. I'm passing it along to you guys. Experimenting is going to be one of the best things you can do with this media. Explaining how little water to use is kind of tough until you've done it yourself. Until you've added too much water and you've lifted that pigment up off your surface, it's kind of hard to gauge how much watercolor, how much water to use. Now, you may want to sharpen your crayons, especially if you want to get a fine point to draw with. And when you do that, I recommend that you sharpen them over a palette. And this is just a $2 plastic palette from Ocean State Job Lot. You could even go to the Dollar Tree and get a set, get one of those, day of the week pill organizers, just something so you have, an area to sharpen a bunch of those colors. I don't sharpen too often, but I often will want like my burnt sienna and my white and my indigo, colors that I use a lot that I like to draw with. I often will like to sharpen those, but don't waste those shavings, because that is pure pigment and you want to make sure that you don't waste it, because it is, and it's very handy when you need to cover a large area or you want a super bright, rich, intense highlight. Going from that palette is going to be so much easier. You apply it basically just like gouache. And honestly, if I had to relate these watercolor crayons to a product, I would say it's probably more like gouache than any other media. It does have a little bit of that finish that a colored pencil would have. It's got that silky kind of waxy feel to it because there is wax in this product. But it really reminds me of gouache. Now here you can see I'm going in with the sticks and I'm adding some detail. And what I'm trying to achieve here is the folds and the kind of crepe papery texture that these beautiful poppy leaves have. And so when you start actually anytime you're coloring with the watercolor crayons, what I want you to try to keep in mind is to go with the contours of whatever it is you're drawing. So when I was blocking in those colors, even though it looked pretty sloppy and I was kind of just scribbling them in, I was making sure my lines would go with it, like with the direction of those folds in the flowers. So if you were like sketching, let's say, a ball, you'd want your marks to go with the contour of the ball. You want to make sure that you want past you that blocks in those colors to be thinking about future you who's going to have to blend those colors. So you want those strokes to go in the direction that you eventually want your brush strokes to go in, because honestly, it doesn't really matter that much, except you may decide that, oh, I really like the way that mark laid down. I don't think I want to dissolve it. And also it makes it so you don't have to add very much water to get them to blend out the way you want. But it's always nice to give yourself that option that, well, if I like this mark, if I like these strokes, I don't have to dissolve them. I can keep that freshness. Just like with like pastel, how, when you're doing a pastel painting, like with a soft pastels, sometimes you don't want to blend because you want that freshness. And that's the same thing with the watercolor crayons too. Now that technique there, where I was just using my wet brush and picking pigment up off the stick, that's another wonderful technique. It's kind of like having that palette that I just showed you a few minutes ago. You can pick up really rich, thick color from the crayons themselves and use them kind of like a pan of watercolor. It's very handy. And then you can go right back in and draw with your crayons. So it's just such a versatile medium. Now I know some artists that actually will take a slice off of each of their crayons and put them in a palette like that, but I don't do that just because I'm probably going to sharpen them anyway, so I might as well just wait till I need to do that. But I know artists that do that so they can have a little travel palette. For me, I love the fact that I could pick up the sticks, draw with them, and then also use them as a paint by like picking up the pigment with my brush. So leaving them in the stick form, unless I'm sharpening them, is my method. But of course, you can do whatever makes sense to you. We're all different people. If you're working on miniatures, miniature little paintings, it might be so much more useful for you to have those sliced up into like one of those little miniature Stephanie Law palettes that are so adorable. That might be your method. And it's a versatile product, so you can do that. Now, something I want to mention as well is that there's not a really big savings to purchasing a large set. I mean, they will be a little bit cheaper per stick, but there's also a lot of colors that are quite similar to one another, and you can buy these open stock if you're getting the Caran brand. I don't believe the Lyra brand are available open stock, at least not in America that I'm aware of, but Caran are. And often I've walked into independent art stores to pick up a couple sticks because I've used them up, and they are like less than $2 a stick. They're usually around like $1.30 a stick. They are a little bit more. I don't know what the retail is, maybe like $3. I think Blick has them around $2.25, something like that per stick. But that means that if you use the color up, you can replace it. It also means that you can choose your own custom palette of colors. You don't need to purchase a set and get what the set tells you you need. You can say, well, geez, I've been making art for a long time. I know I love the color ultramarine. I know I love the color burnt sienna. I know I'm going to use a lot of white. I know I'm going to use this and that. And you can also say, I'm probably never going to use, one, like there's several greens that are very similar. You might be like, yeah, I'm not going to use that one because I can just use that one and add white to it. You can make your own custom palette, and it's not really that much more expensive per stick. I found a great deal on these when I bought mine. I had been keeping my peepers open for them because I had a smaller set and I used that. Actually, I had a smaller set when I was a kid and I used it up and I loved it. Oh my gosh, so wonderful. It was a set of 10. And my parents picked up for me at Martin's. And then after my friend Ellen had showed me her techniques with the watercolor crayons, I saw a set of 15 half sticks, and I bought that. And the water soluble, the portfolios, and I used those for quite a while and just kept my eyes open for a good sale. And I picked up that set of 84 for like $60, and it was crazy. I've never seen them that low, but I was patient and I waited, and I did add different colors as needed. Like I added the metallics a few years ago when I noticed that they were available. I don't use them that often though, to be honest with you. I tend to use the most vibrant colors. I also use the earth tones. I tend to use some mid values, but you definitely do not need the full 84 set unless you find like a really good deal on it. You can do a lot with not a ton of colors. So keep that in mind. That said, if you are on a budget, the Lyra brand is so good. You definitely could do this with the Lyra brand. And in that case, I probably would recommend purchasing the larger set of them. I think they come in like 12, 24, and it's either 48 or 60. Maybe it's a set of 48 for $60. I'll link everything down below so you can have a look and compare. But I have this set of 24, and I like that. In fact, when I go to teach, I bring my Lyra watercolor crayons because they're more affordable, and I'm not going to worry about them, walking off in class or something. But I do bring my my half stick set of Caran d'Ache. They're pretty short. People can try them out, see if they like them. But I really like to use the Lyras in classes because I'm not worried about losing them, but they perform really well. And then I also bring, like, if you have gelatos, if you have any of those water-soluble gel crayons, you can definitely give them a try. Now, they might be a little bit more transparent on a toned surface, but you could definitely get the feel to see if you like something like this. Now, I'm still on that second layer at this point, and it is a little time consuming. You basically kind of go through and you kind of draw on those folds and you paint them in, you blend them in, you get your values right, and it's kind of a meditative process. Now, you could do this in colored pencil. If you already have a set of colored pencils and you're like, oh, this is really pretty, but I just can't get started in another medium, Lindsay, are you crazy? You're killing me. I can't do another thing. I've just got to stick with what I have. Well, grab those colored pencils, guys. Draw it out small, like maybe the size of a greeting card or something, and have fun with it. This would be great with any of your opaque colored pencils, your wax-based pencils. I would recommend Prismacolor or Derwent Color Soft, anything that's got a little bit more of an opacity that will show up on toned paper. That's, I think, where some of the magic happens, because when you're working on toned paper, and you could do this in like a craft sketchbook, like a toned tan or toned gray sketchbook even, it would be gorgeous. By having that mid value, it automatically assigns a mid value, so you're not afraid to go in with your dark shadows and go in with your bright lights. And it also takes a lot of the work away because you already have that mid tone there. You don't have to worry about what you're going to put in the background because there's already a background. So I really like that. Now you might be saying, but Lindsay, I've spent so much money on watercolor paper, I can't go out and buy anything else. Well, that's great because you can take your watercolor paper and you can use your watercolors to put down a wash of color or even a more complex background if you want, and work on top of that with the watercolor crayons. They're fantastic on watercolor paper. In fact, that texture on the watercolor paper will make it easier for you to layer up because it will hold a little bit more product than this mat board, which is fairly smooth, is going to hold. Another nice product is Canson Me Tints pastel paper. That will definitely hold up to the small amount of water that we're going to use here. But they've recently also come out with Canson Me Tint boards. So it's like a matte board. So if you don't have a bunch of matte scraps like I do, I would recommend getting that. And it's probably a higher quality surface to work on anyway. So absolutely get that. Use what you have, definitely. You probably have something that's going to work with these crayons. They're very forgiving because they're like gouache, because they're opaque. They're not relying on that you can use them on a lot of different surfaces. They're not really relying on the surface as much as, say, watercolor would be, or like oil paints. They're just a lot more forgiving and versatile. They're just wonderful. Every time I pick them up and use them, I'm like, why don't I use these more? They're just so fun. You can search watercolor crayons on my YouTube channel. I have some greeting cards done. I have like a chicken that I did in, I think I used only 5 or 6 crayons. That was a lot of fun. That's just on watercolor paper. And it's on a watercolor greeting card, actually. I've got, I think I might have a ballerina and an art journal page. I have a bunch of different ones. So you can check it out and see if it's something that you would enjoy before investing money. And like I said, the Crayola Portfolio water-soluble oil pastels are very inexpensive. And while they're not quite as opaque and they're a little more greasy feeling, they kind of feel like a lipstick, like a gelato if you have those, they'll definitely give you a really good approximation about what working with watercolor crayons is. Now, the reason I'm turning my work around is because I don't want to rest my hand on my artwork if I can help it. Now, you could put a piece of white paper down to rest your hand on when you're working. I don't like to do that when I'm filming because I'm afraid I'll cover too much up and you won't be able to see what I'm doing. But and because I don't do pencil and crayon tutorials that often, I was just afraid that since I'm not used to it, I might cover up more than I should. So I turn it around to keep my hands out of the way. And also, because we're on a toned background and I want my edges clean, I just find that when I am pushing my brush up against an edge, I can control how sharp it is a lot better. So I turn my work so that the edge of my brush is pointing kind of towards the edge. So I'm going to get a nice sharp edge. Now, I want to talk about brushes really quick because I mentioned how you don't want to have a ton of water on this. You don't want to use your watercolor brushes. I know it sounds like, Lindsay, why not? It's watercolor crayon. Why don't I want to use my watercolor brushes? Well, you're not going to hurt your watercolor brushes if you do use them. So don't worry if you already have. But if you use a golden Taklon brush that's meant for acrylics, it will work a lot better because it's not going to hold that much water. So with a watercolor brush, we want that brush to hold a lot of water, right? Because we want to bring all kinds of juicy washes across our pages. But when we're working with watercolor crayon, we want just enough water that's going to move our pigment. And also, we need a brush that's got a little more pushing power. And our watercolor brushes are generally soft and absorbent. And our acrylic painting brushes are less absorbent and they have a little bit more firmness that can push our, sorry about my head in the shot there, they can push our pigment across. So that's what you want. So I like the golden Taklon bristle. There's a lot of different brushes that have that. Royal and Langnickel makes some very affordable brushes with golden Taklon fibers. Their Zen All Media line and their Menta All Media line. Also the Princeton has quite a few affordable lines that have the golden Taklon hairs. They're just really good for this. They're also really good for gouache. So I will use my gouache brushes for this. I actually use them for acrylics too because I'm really good about cleaning my brushes. So yeah, I will use my acrylics too. I don't have an issue with damaging them. I do gouache way more than acrylic, so they don't get that much use with acrylics, but still. Now here we can go on with even more layers. So keep that in mind. If you're not happy with this stage, don't be discouraged because you're not done yet. If you're looking at your work and you're like, oh, it doesn't look the way I want it. It doesn't look refined. It doesn't look finished. Well, it's not that your work is bad. Your work just isn't done yet. You need another layer. If you're not happy with it, you know, even if you complete it to the level that I've completed it to, you followed the tutorial, but you're just like, you know, I'm not really that happy with it. Yours doesn't have to be done yet. You can keep working on it. You can put it away in a closet for 2 weeks and then take it out and look at it with fresh eyes and keep working on it. That's the other great thing about watercolor crayons. They're never fully dry, meaning like gouache, you can go in and reactivate them. Something could happen and I have to leave my studio and I have this half done, and I could come back a month later and pick up where I left off. They dry, but they're always able to be reactivated. So because of that, you also want to keep that in mind when you're preserving your work. Now, in a sketchbook, it's going to be fine. But if you wanted to display your art, you definitely want to put it in a frame behind glass or plexiglass. I prefer glass, but behind some sort of glazing with a mat, because you do not want your surface to touch the glass. So when I said these are very forgiving and you can use them on pretty much any surface, I meant pretty much any paper-based surface. I probably wouldn't use them on canvas just because they would have a hard time bonding with like a primed canvas. Generally, your canvases are primed with acrylic gesso. They would have a hard time bonding with that. So any sort of paper surface like mat board, watercolor paper, pastel paper, sketchbook paper, any of those surfaces will be great for your watercolor crayons. But because paper is a fragile surface and these watercolor crayons never really dry, they're always able to be reactivated. They don't go through a chemical change like acrylics do. They don't dry out like oil paints do. You need to protect them. And you don't want them touching the glass, because if any condensation gets in there, then what do you think that water touching the glass, touching the painting is going to do? It's going to reactivate and it's going to make mush. So you need to have airspace between your glass and your artwork. And just a simple mat will work just great. You can go to your craft store, your art store, buy one already cut, or you can cut it yourself. But you want that space between your glass and your work on paper. I recommend glass because glass doesn't flex and plexiglass can flex. So if somebody like pushes on the glazing, like I don't know, you got a toddler and it's standing on the couch and, you know, bats at your painting, it presses that plexiglass onto the watercolor crayon or oil pastel. If you decided to try this in oil pastel, I think it'd be beautiful in oil pastel. It could stick to the plexiglass and leave some residue. So that's why I recommend glass. Plexiglass is great for watercolor. In fact, it does provide a little bit more UV protection than glass, but any sort of pastel, I definitely recommend a glass because there's no static electricity and there's no flex in the glazing. So I hope that hopefully will help you when you're framing other things. Now here we're getting towards the end and I'm just putting in some final details. I'm going in with a sharpened crayon and adding just the highlights on the folds. I'm using a small brush and some of the shavings from my palette to dab on some highlights. I'm just refining and finishing it up. And I'm really happy with how this turned out. If you do need more sharp details, you can use your watercolor pencils. You can even dip them in a little drop of water to activate them to make them nice and bright. Just have fun with them. And remember, you can find the real-time version of this in Critique Club for $5 a month. You have access to this real-time tutorial as well as 50 other more advanced real-time lessons, and you can even upload your work for me to critique. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.